Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. We're going to be examining Psalm 74 in this lesson, so let's get started by reading the psalm in its entirety. Psalm 74, a maskil of Asaph, verse 1. O God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? Remember the nation you purchased long ago, the people of your inheritance whom you redeemed, Mount Zion where you dwelt. Turn your steps towards these everlasting ruins. All this destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. Your foes roared in the place where you met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through a thicket of trees. They smashed all the carved paneling with their axes and hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, "We will crush them completely." They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. We are given no signs from God, no prophets are left, and none of us knows how long this will be. How long will the enemy mock you, God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. But God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Remember how the enemy has mocked you, Yahweh, how foolish people have reviled your name. Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts. Do not forget the lives of your afflicted people forever. Have regard for your covenant, because haunts of violence fill the dark places of the land. Do not let the oppressed retreat in disgrace. May the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, and defend your cause. Remember how fools mock you all day long. Do not ignore the clamor of your adversaries, the uproar of your enemies, which rises continually. Okay, we're going to study this psalm, and the title of our study is, Has God Been Defeated? Has God Been Defeated? A study of Psalm 74. Now in Psalm 73, Asaph struggles with three questions. Is God truly good to Israel? Is it better to live like the wicked? And will God deal with oppressors? Asaph's doubt about God's goodness stems from his perspective that wicked, rich people never seem to struggle, while those who endeavor to live with pure hearts know endless difficulty. In the end, Asaph comes to some important realizations. First, during a visit to the Jerusalem temple, he is reminded of the power and authority of God. And this reminder helped to bolster what he already knew to be true, that God will judge the wicked. Second, Asaph learned a new perspective about life. He began to realize that a good life is not measured by material wealth and prosperity. A good life is one lived in relationship with God, for only God can bring one to glory. Asaph concludes, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Yahweh my refuge. I will tell of all your deeds. That's the last verse of Psalm 73. Now, Psalm 74 is also part of the Asaph collection, but the setting for this psalm is much different than Psalm 73. In Psalm 73, Asaph is able to visit and worship at the Jerusalem temple, but in Psalm 74, the temple has been destroyed. Verse 7 says, "They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name." Now, this setting presents some difficulties, and there are at least two options for how we should view Psalm 74. Number one, Psalm 74 was written by Asaph during a time when Jerusalem had been attacked and the temple had been damaged, but not entirely destroyed. And perhaps here he's just using exaggerated language to describe how traumatic this event was for the people. Option two, which is the option that I'll kind of be presenting in this study, is that Psalm 74 was written after Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by the Babylonians, but Asaph was not the author, since, of course, these events occurred centuries after his life and death. It could be that the compilers of the Psalter, wanting to include this psalm in the Asaph collection for thematic reasons, went ahead and ascribed it to Asaph, or in the style of Asaph, even though he himself did not write it. And that thematic connection that brings Psalms 73 and 74 together is highlighted in the use of this word ruin, which we find in 73 verse 18 and 74 and verse 3. In Psalm 73, Asaph believed that God would judge the wicked and bring them to a state of utter ruin. That's what he believed. However, in Psalm 74, the opposite has occurred. The wicked have come to Zion and turned God's dwelling into a place of everlasting ruins. And so while Psalm 73 explores an individual struggle about whether or not God is good to Israel, Psalm 74 explores a communal struggle about how God could allow his city and his people to be destroyed. Grant offers this helpful introduction to the psalm. Psalm 74 is a traditional lament or complaint voiced by the Old Testament community of faith. It is a response to the loss of the temple as their central place of worship, as well as a response to the hiddenness of God's plans for their future amidst the present sufferings. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the exile of Judah that followed engendered great trauma, both in political and religious terms. The Old Testament covenant community had lost the three great signs of their religious identity: the land, the Davidic king, and the temple. That is the visible evidence of salvation that God had worked for them in the past, the land, his rule in the present, exercised through the monarchy, and his presence among the people manifest in the temple. The removal of these external confirmations of Yahweh's active allegiance to his people caused a communal crisis of faith, much akin to the individual crisis of faith faced by Asaph in Psalm 73. How are God's people to cope with such a public failure and the doubts that result from it? And with these introductory thoughts in mind, we turn now our attention to the text, Psalm 74, a maskil of Asaph, beginning in verse 1. O God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? Remember the nation you purchased long ago, the people of your inheritance, whom you redeemed, Mount Zion, where you dwelt. Turn your steps towards these everlasting ruins. All this destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. Like a typical lament prayer, Psalm 74 opens with an address to God in the form of two why questions. Why have you rejected us? And why does your anger smolder against us? Now, some of the most intense laments in the Psalter focus on trying to understand why God has done something or why he has failed to act when the psalmist believes he should. The classic example, of course, is Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? In this instance, the two why questions center on God's apparent rejection and abandonment of his own people. Psalm 74 assumes that God has permanently rejected Israel, and that rather than shepherding them, as he did in days past, he has smoldered his sheep with intense, burning anger. The psalmist interjects a reminder of the covenant in verse 2, using the language of inheritance, redemption, Zion, and dwelling, as if to say, remember all these things that you gave to us, all these tokens of the covenant? And then he quickly returns to the problem in verse 3, and that's ruin and destruction. So how did this happen? Who has destroyed the holy city and its temple? Well, we carry on now, beginning in verse 4. Your foes roared in the place where you met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through a thicket of trees. They smashed all the carved paneling with their axes and hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, "We will crush them completely." They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. Those responsible for the temple's destruction are described as God's foes or adversaries in verse 4. And this label juxtaposes them with the sheep of God's pasture, but it also accentuates the incredulity of the psalmist. I mean, how is this possible? How is it possible that you have allowed your enemies to defeat you, God? And not only have God's foes defeated him, they've done so with the ease of chopping down a tree. The sacred space where God dwells has been burned to the ground. The foes boast that nothing can stop them from utterly annihilating Jerusalem. Notice the last line of verse 8. They burned every place where God was worshiped in the land. The Hebrew word here that's translated land is often translated into English as earth. And so the idea could be that by destroying the Jerusalem temple, these enemies of God have obliterated every meeting place of God on the whole earth. The worship of Yahweh will now vanish from the world. And what is God doing about this catastrophe? Well, from the perspective of Psalm 74, nothing. Nothing. Picking up in verse 9, we're given no signs from God. No prophets are left. And none of us knows how long this will be. How long will the enemy mock you, God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. Now, the psalmist outlines the heart of the disaster. If the backdrop of Psalm 74 is the Babylonian invasion and destruction of Jerusalem, it's noteworthy here that the human suffering caused by that calamity is not the primary focus. While the human element will be mentioned at the end, Psalm 74 is more concerned with the theological quandary the temple's destruction elicits. At the heart of this disaster, the psalmist is worried about God's reputation. We might recall Moses, who protested God's plan to kill the Israelites after the golden calf incident. And one of his arguments was based on how that action, wiping out his own people, would make him look to the Egyptians. So Moses was concerned for God's reputation, and so is the author of Psalm 74. Verse 9 claims that God has not provided any information about what's happening. No signs, no prophets, no word from the Lord about how long this crisis will last. Now, I want to say this seems like kind of an odd claim to make, considering there were prophets, especially Jeremiah, who revealed information about the Babylonian invasion. But as Golden Gate points out, his voice was silenced. Jeremiah was prophesying and offering signs in Jerusalem and declaring how long, but he was taken off elsewhere soon after the city's fall. The book of Jeremiah also shows how there were many other prophets in the city in the years running up to its fall, but they would all have been silenced by the event itself. Having promised that it would not happen, they might have nothing to say when it did. And so, with Lamentations 2, we see this portrayal that prophecy is gone from the community. Here they are, staring at this ash heap, wondering, lost in darkness. How long will God be mocked? How long will God allow such dishonor to befall him? Why does he withhold his mighty hand? What is he waiting for? In the previous psalm, Asaph struggled with the tension of what he knew to be true about God and his own lived experience. And Psalm 74 is going to step right into that tension. So far, this psalm has explained what the people have experienced, and to them, it appears that God has been defeated by his enemies. Now, in the next section, the community is going to confess what it believes about God, even though they are struggling to accept that it is true because of what they have experienced. We turn into verse 12. But God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Now, in spite of all that has occurred, the psalmist declares God's kingship. But he does so in a unique way. What follows in verses 13 through 17 is a poetic depiction of the work of creation, which explains why the psalmist says that God is king from long ago. Another interesting observation is that the creation work is introduced as an act of bringing salvation on the earth in verse 12. So what exactly is going on here? Well, to understand this section, we need to be at least a little familiar with the worldview of ancient Near Eastern people. You see, back then, warfare between tribes was seen as a battle between the patron deities of those peoples. When the Babylonians defeated Israel and destroyed the temple, it was viewed as a conclusive victory of Marduk, the god of the Babylonians, over Yahweh. The psalmist, wanting to urge God to act, recalls a time when Yahweh was the one who reigned supreme over all the gods of the earth. And he uses here a Babylonian-style creation myth about a battle of the gods, which occurred at the very beginning of creation. See, Psalm 74 is basically asserting that Yahweh defeated all other powers, and he reigned over the whole earth from creation. And so now he needs to reassert his dominance by emphatically saying "you" 7 times as he addresses God in verses 13 through 17. The psalmist asserts that Israel's God is the true power in the world. Yahweh is the God who defeated all the other gods. He subdued the chaotic seas. He brought forth dry land. He cast the sea monsters down into the depths. And by depicting creation in this way as a defeat of pagan deities and their power, the psalmist can say that God's work in creation was also an act of salvation. He rescued the earth from the chaotic forces of darkness. And of course, if God could defeat the gods of the enemy then, he can surely rise up and do the same again. And so now the author calls upon God to act. Verse 18, remember how the enemy has mocked you, Yahweh, how foolish people have reviled your name. Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts. Do not forget the lives of your afflicted people forever. Have regard for your covenant, because haunts of violence fill the dark places of this land. Do not let the oppressed retreat in disgrace. May the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, and defend your cause. Remember how fools mock you all day long. Do not ignore the clamor of your adversaries, the uproar of your enemies, which rises continually. Psalm 74 closes with a final salvo of urgent petitions. And while the needs of the afflicted Israelites is finally incorporated, notice how the focus is still on God's reputation. The enemies are mocking Yahweh's defeat and holding his name is in contempt, and they're simultaneously oppressing God's covenant people. Violence has covered the land, and Yahweh's own have been forced to flee. The psalmist asks that God rise up and defend his people so that they will not be forced into a retreat. He wants them to be able to stand and praise their mighty and victorious God. But the only way this can happen is if God turns his attention to the enemy who continually boasts and mocks against the might and power of Yahweh. Psalms 73 and 74 have been coupled together to explore some difficult questions about God, the world, and the place of God's people in a world that is less than ideal, far from the ideal. Grant explains how these Psalms challenge our human perspective. We saw in our study of Psalm 73 that the way in which we view and respond to life is often shaped by our perspectives on it. The poet who wrote Psalm 74 had a relentlessly theological perspective on life. Together with the author of the book of Lamentations, the psalmist looks beyond the outward circumstances of life to see God's hand at work in the events that he and his fellows were experiencing. It would have been very easy for the psalmist to focus on the destructive power of the armies of Babylon or the political weakness of Judah in his day, but instead, he realizes that the events experienced in the exile had a theological root rather than a geopolitical one. Rather than developing a theological, God-centered framework for how to view life, many believers have fallen into the trap of being entirely engrossed with the events of the day. Christians fixate on 24-hour news channels, social media, and their favorite online talking heads. They engage in acts of escapism or they become workaholics, choosing to ignore rather than engage. Just like with Psalm 73, Psalm 74 challenges us to think in a different way about the world. Of course, we can't ignore the world around us, but neither can we become so consumed by it that we forget what really matters. There's a path which remembers who God is and what God is doing in the world and seeks opportunities to embrace that divine mission in daily living. Is God good to Israel? Yes, even though it doesn't always look that way. Has God been defeated? No, even though it may appear so. As Christians walk this theological, God-centered path, we need to ask God how and where he is at work and what role he would have us, his people, to play in this generation. Thank you so much for joining me in this examination of Psalm 74. Come back next time as we continue through the Psalter. God bless.